Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast that tells the story behind the book. It includes insights from authors about how they compose their work, what inspires them, and what they hope you'll take away from their book. Here's your host for this episode of Books on Air, Suzanne Harris.
Welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm Sloan Fremont, filling in for Suzanne Harris. This is a podcast where listeners get the secret story behind every book. Joining me today is Stephen Jones, author of the book Galusha, Crisis and Courage in a Civil War Pastor. Have you ever faced a serious moral dilemma and realized that there is a costly way through it and an easier way out of it? And which one would you choose? This was the moral dilemma that Reverend Galusha Anderson faced when he arrived from the North to serve a congregation of divided loyalties in a divided city during the Civil War. Stephen, I want to welcome you to the Books on Air podcast.
Thank you, Sloan. Good to be with you.
Yeah, so let's start out by telling the audience just a little bit about yourself and what led you to write your book, Galusha, Crisis and Courage in a Civil War Pastor.
Okay. Well, like Galusha Anderson, I have been a lifelong American Baptist pastor, and I was called to serve Second Baptist Church in St. Louis, which is the church that he served during the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And I happen to be, it's an old church founded in 1833, and I happen to be kind of meandering through the archive room and the shelves and everything in there, and I ran across his book. This is it right here, A Border City During the Civil War. And I read it a couple of times. I was kind of intrigued by it. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't know much about him. In fact, I don't know that I'd even heard of him before I took over that pastorate. But he had a very significant pastorate in St. Louis. It was kind of a pivotal moment in the life of that church. And it was kind of a crucible moment in his own life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so your book is a little different in that it's both a novel and a biography, and it includes both fiction and nonfiction. Can you tell us how you were able to weave that all together into the story?
Well, that's what took so long.
Yeah.
I've been trying to get for over a decade. Well, when I read his book is a little bit of a dry history of St. Louis, the civil societies, the prisons, the commerce, the organizations, the churches, and all that. And but I realized that when I was reading it, that didn't really, it was okay, and it's history. I appreciate history and all that, but it didn't cause me to want to write a book about it. But when I was reading that, I realized that underneath that story, that history that he was telling his own personal story. I don't think he meant to. I know that wasn't his intent, but there was a lot of his own personal story that was coming out in kind of the underneath side of his much thicker book than mine. And it intrigued me to hear his story. And I thought, could I begin to kind of pull that story out and see if it fits together? And it does. There's a lot of it in there, but you have to just go through every page and occasionally these little snippets of his own life. And so that's what I did. There were some places missing, and I tried to do my very best to write a few chapters in it that would help embellish the story and tell his story, because that was not his intent. But that's where I got it, and that's where it came from. And so it is biography. An awful lot of the chapters and words are his, but there are some sections that I had to add to kind of flesh out the story some.
Mm-hmm. And so can you tell us how you weaved his story with those kind of that underlying story you saw when you were reading? Can you tell us how you weaved his story into, and maybe even what you saw with his story and how that parallels some of your experiences as a pastor, or even, maybe people who are faithful and want to do the right thing. And there's, as I talked about at the beginning about that moral dilemma that we all often face. Can you talk about and maybe give us some examples of that?
Well, the unique thing about St. Louis during the Civil War is that it's at the far west end of the Mason-Dixon line. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the very few cities in the United States. Of course, the United States was at war with itself during the Civil War, North versus South. And so St. Louis is one of the very few places where people on both sides lived side by side. they shopped in the same shops. They lived on the same streets, the same neighborhoods. They attended the same churches, belonged to the same organizations and clubs and so forth. And yet they were sending their sons out to kill the other sons on the battlefield. So it's kind of you don't usually think of that happening in quite that close a proximity. So
Right.
these people had to learn how to hold deep passions, which they did, both pro-Union, pro-Confederacy, but not have it blow up in the city of St. Louis. And the fighting largely did not take place in the city of St. Louis. It happened all around it, but not in it. And that was partly because the city had kind of an unwritten agreement that it wouldn't be talked about publicly too much. Now, that kind of broke down eventually, but that was kind of the beginning. So Galusha he came from the north. He was from Western New York, and then he served his first church in Janesville, Wisconsin, very rural place, very far removed from the Civil War. They probably had soldiers off and families in the Wisconsin infantry and all of that. But he basically, he didn't have much of an impact. The Civil War didn't have much of an impact on his first pastor. But when he moved to St. Louis, my goodness, it just, it was right there in front of them. They had never lived near slavery, they'd never known it before nor his wife. And it just hit them in the face. And so then they're kind of left with the very difficult decision. How do you do this? And all the pastors in St. Louis did it by keeping quiet. They didn't address it, because to address it meant to stir the pot and stir the waters and create all kinds of problems. And he did that for a year and a half, 2 years, and he just couldn't do it anymore. He said it's wrong, it's morally wrong to treat some people as slaves and to own them as slaves, and I just can't do this anymore. So there was one Sunday night when he finally decided, as the first pastor in St. Louis, to speak out against slavery and against the secession of the southern states, against the Confederacy. And it did what everybody feared that it would, which was that his church was one of the larger churches in town, and it was not quite evenly divided, but there was an awful lot of Confederate supporters in his congregation. And the next Sunday morning, they were all gone. They sent several peacemaking delegations to try to work things out. If he would agree never to bring it up again, they would come back. And he just felt like, I can't do that. My mandate as a pastor is to address injustice and inequality, and I cannot agree to not tell the truth. So that was kind of that crucible moment. That followed an earlier moment in his life, which was even more personally hard and difficult and challenging, in that he and his wife moved to St. Louis with one infant son who died after they arrived. And they had another son who lived for a while and died. And then they had a third son, and that son and the wife died in delivery, or in that period. So he came to St. Louis with a family, and within about 18 months, he lost 3 infant boys and a wife. And you can imagine how challenging a moment that would be for anybody. And and in a pastor, it's hard to go through those public, or those losses, very personal losses, in a public way. There are people in congregations who can make those transitions with you and put their arm around you and walk with you and fine. And there are other people for whom that's a little more difficult to ask. And so he had to go through that and suffered most of that privately. Although everybody knew he was going through it. He remarried eventually. And then not long after that, this slavery thing hit. And what happened to the congregation is it was about cut in half, not quite in half, but almost. But then Second Baptist Church became known as the Union Church. It wasn't the name, but it became known as a strong Union church in St. Louis. And pretty much they regained all that they had lost by people who deeply supported the Union and were deeply against slavery. who came to the church, and that really just changed the trajectory of the church from that point on.
Yeah, and that willingness to stand and speak up in the face of injustice, and not being able to just quietly go along, right? I think that's something everybody listening can relate to. What did you learn about the cost of speaking the truth, or maybe upsetting the status quo, as you researched and wrote your book?
Yeah. Well, I've been a pastor for 50 years, so I know this from the inside out, and I think every pastor does. You can be a pastor and not address anything that matters beyond the just inside life of your parish. But if we're followers of Jesus, that doesn't really fit the person that we're following. So I think that had he come to St. Louis and had he stayed 10 years, let's say he came in the 1850s and then the Civil War in the 1860s, I think it could have been a different outcome, because my experience is that if you take these strong stands very early in your pastorate, before you've really gotten to know the people and they've gotten to know you, but after you've buried a few of their beloved members, and you've married a few of their beloved members, and you've baptized a few of their beloved members, and you've been to the hospital with many of them, you do that for 6, 8, 10 years, and your life and theirs are woven in together. There's a trust, people will give you a little bit more rope to address what you feel you need called to address if you have that kind of history. Unfortunately, he came right at the breakout of the Civil War, and felt called, whether he was right or wrong is history, I guess, but he felt called that he had to address it in the kind of first 2-3 years of his pastorate. And because of that, and because he'd just been through this terrible personal loss, where he probably had turned in on himself some, didn't get out as much, just processing his own grief over the loss of his wife and his 3 sons. The combination of all that together was probably not the best for taking such a big stand. I can't criticize him for it. I actually find him to be something of a hero of faith, because sometimes you just have to do it. And if it costs you, it costs you. If it costs your church, it costs your church. I think sometimes you have to say it's worth it. But certainly if you could time these things out and say, well, I can't really address this right now because it's so divisive, but if I had another couple of years, I will address it. It's probably an easier thing on the congregation. But in point of fact, he didn't feel like he had that kind of time, and it changed Second Baptist Church from that point on. It was a different kind of congregation from the 1860s on, because of his courageous stand.
Yeah, because of his stance. And do you think his taking that stance, and even though people left, do you think it had an impact do you think there was like a ripple effect out of actually having an impact of
huge? It was huge. Yeah. In fact, not within, I think it was like 12 to 18 months after he did that, practically every Methodist, most Presbyterian, there was one that didn't, but most Presbyterian, most Episcopal pastors, the mainline denomination pastors also spoke out. Yeah. And actually, it even caused a couple, including one Presbyterian, to speak out on the Confederate side. But the pastors were no longer muzzled. They were no longer quiet. They felt like they had to stand for whatever truth they felt called to do. And he was the one that started that. And that was the ripple effect. It didn't blow apart the city. The Civil War never came into the city in a wholesale kind of way. Mm-hmm. But I mean, there was some fighting and things, but not major battles in St. Louis. And the city didn't. They were just afraid that the whole city would just unravel, right? With neighbors shooting neighbors in the backyards and all that kind of stuff. That largely, it never quite got that bad. But he did have a big impact on the main, I'd say, the mainline churches, mm-hmm. and the courage of the mainline pastors to join him and speak out against slavery. But there are a couple of stories about pastors losing their pulpits in St. Louis. Some of them couldn't survive.
And as I hear you tell this story, it's all it takes is one person to stand up in the face of injustice. And and that, we often think we're small, what we do doesn't matter, but that's like the farthest from the truth. I mean, this is a perfect example of that.
It is. I think the other thing we can say is that in that era, pastors had a good deal more public clout than perhaps we do today. And because of that, it was a very big deal to have one of the St. Louis pastors step up and say, this is wrong. Slavery is wrong, and we can't continue it in our country. He was also a very strong supporter of Abraham Lincoln. I think he tried very hard not to bring partisanship into the pulpit. But it was really hard to do when you're fighting a war and your president is leading that effort. But he was a strong Abraham Lincoln supporter as well.
Yeah. So what surprised you the most in your research for the book?
Well, I think one of them is just trying to put myself in his shoes of personal loss as a pastor around his family. I've had some personal challenges, not death, but personal challenges in my family, and how you live with those in a public situation. Pastors have a very unique role in that our public is right there with us, whether you got 100, 200, 300, or 1,000 members. They're right there. They're looking at you, interacting with you. It's a small community that to whom you're accountable, and it's hard to own up to your losses, your pain, your grief, and then that just followed right after his sense of what he had to do as a moral spokesperson, and that really touched me. That he had gone through that, but was able to process that. He did get remarried, which I think helped a great deal, and I think his second wife, Mary Eleanor, was a good deal more supportive of him going out on a limb. And I'm sure that in part, his partner doing that helped a great deal. But it's just that combination of the story and the impact it had. He was on kill lists. They discovered the Confederate. They went into a Confederate stronghold in St. Louis. The Union did, and they took all the books out of it, and they had lists of people who were going to be arrested and lists of people who were going to be killed the minute they found them. Galusha was the number one person on the list of people to be strung up and hung as soon as they got their hands on it. So it wasn't just you and I disagree and we agree to disagree. It was a war, and so it did have a pretty serious price to pay, and his life was in jeopardy. One of the stories that he tells is the Presbyterian pastor down the street from him also is named Anderson. And he was walking to the post office one day to pick up his mail, which is the way they did it in those days. And several people came out of a alley and threw bricks at him and hit him in the head. And he was all, banged up and everything. And they thought they were throwing the bricks at Galusha because they're both named Anderson. They're both pastors. Right. And so the Presbyterian, who was very much a pro-Confederacy supporter, was really irritated with him because he took the punishment for Galusha's stand. So, lots of things like that happen. I tell as many of those stories as I can in the book to show what happens. But I think your point's well taken that all of us face moral dilemmas, not just pastors, but at one time or another. Whether we're persons of faith or not, we all have values and things that we see going on around us that probably needs to be addressed. And should we do it or somebody else? It's kind of easy to duck and say, well, I'm gonna let Sloan take this one on, and I'm gonna take this one easy. But there does come a time, and I think you're right, when one voice can make a huge difference, and I think his voice made a huge difference in St. Louis, particularly encouraging other pastors to take the same stand.
Yeah. Very inspiring story. My guest this week has been Stephen Jones, author of the book Galusha, Crisis and Courage in a Civil War Pastor. Before we close out today, what do you hope the readers learn or take away after reading your book?
Well, I hope they learn to take courage. I'm not saying that Galusha is the only way to go, or that's the only way to do it. And as I mentioned to you, I think if he could have stayed 8 to 10 years and then done it, if time would have allowed that, probably would have gone a lot better. And there are moments when you have to kind of say this isn't the right time. But I think mostly we lack courage, and I think Galusha's life urges us to try to be as courageous as we can with our faith and our values and what we know to be true.
Yeah, I love that message. Stephen, I want to thank you for joining us today and being our guest on Books on Air.
Thank you, Sloan. Nice to be with you.
You can find more about the book, Galusha, Crisis and Courage in a Civil War Pastor, on Amazon, and I'll link to the book in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also hear this podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. I'm Sloan Fremont, and I hope you'll join us for the next Books on Air podcast. Remember, you never know who's going to be here, and you never know what we're going to talk about. Thank you so much for listening.